Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we got a super special video today. So normally here on the channel, we're talking constructed, janky decks and standard, budget decks and modern, all that kind of stuff. But we're going to break it up a bit today and talk about limited, because Hour of Devastation pre-release events are right around the corner. So today, we're going to go color by color through the commons and uncommons of Hour of Devastation and talk about some of the most underrated and overrated cards. So these are cards you want to look out for when you're building your sealed pool. So the underrated cards are the good cards. These are cards that if you see in your pool, you're probably going to want to play. Some of them are obviously good. Others maybe aren't as obvious, but there is some good reasons to put them in your deck. On the other hand, the overrated cards are the cards that you might be tempted to put in your deck. You might think, oh, this could be good, but probably aren't as good as you're hoping they will be. So hopefully this gives you some information, some sort of a guide for your pre-release. So I think we have 3 underrated and 3 overrated for each color, which means we got a ton of cards to talk about, so we better jump right into it. So first, we have the underrated cards from White. These are the good cards from White. And let's start off with Desert's Hold. So Desert's Hold, the big thing here is you don't have to have a desert for it to be good. It's an Arrest. Arrest is a good card in limited on its own, and if you have a desert, it's just upside. So that's the main thing I wanted to say about this one is don't leave this out of your sealed pool because you don't have a desert. It's great on its own. One of the best removal spells in White in the set. So it's great without a desert, and if you happen to have a desert and gain the life, it's even better. So you want this in your deck no matter what. We also have Angel the God Pharaoh, which is a card that looks a little expensive. I mean, it would be a finisher in a control deck no matter what, but the fact that it has cycling makes it very good. You can cycle it away in the early game if you're digging for lands, or if you don't think you're going to get 6 mana, or looking for an answer, and then in the late game, it's a big flyer that closes out the game, so you'll always want to play this in a lot of your white decks. If you're really synergy based like white black zombies, maybe there's an excuse not to, but for the most part, you're going to want this in your white decks because it's very good thanks to the cycling. Finally, Giroux's Renunciation is a card that might not seem good at first glance. 2 mana, tap 2 target creatures is not really a playable card. However, the cycling makes this card very good. So this is how I see this card. You're playing any sort of creature-heavy white deck. The more aggressive, the better. Maybe 7 games out of 10, you're going to cycle this away and it's going to do nothing. And that's fine. It turns into a new card for 1 mana. And then 3 games out of 10, you're going to use it to tap down 2 blockers, get in a big attack, and be able to kill your opponent. So I think because of the cycling cost, Giroux's Renunciation is actually a really solid card in limited. Now for the overrated cards from White. So these are the ones that you want to be a little skeptical of. First up, God Pharaoh's Faithful. A lot of people mistakenly at first think that life gain is very important. It's not very important, and God Pharaoh's Faithful isn't even good life gain. If you're a base white deck, it's not going to gain you much life. It can never attack because it doesn't have any power. So this, for me, is a sideboard card. I could imagine bringing it in if you're a slow controlling deck against a very aggressive deck just because it's a good blocker. But don't try to build a God Pharaoh's Faithful deck. I would be very hesitant to ever play this in my main deck. I'm sure there's exceptions. Certain decks might want it just as a blocker, but for the most part, start with this in your sideboard and sideboard it in very specific matchups. Next, we have Steadfast Sentinel, and this card just isn't very good for its mana cost. A 2/3 for 4 is below the curve, and while it has Vigilance as an upside, if you really think about Vigilance, that means you get to attack with it for free, basically, and still have it back to block. How often are you going to be able to attack with your 2/3 on turn 4? Not all that often, and then even when it eternalizes, it's a 4/4 for 6, and while that's nice, gives you some card advantage from the graveyard, the body just isn't good enough for this to be exciting. So this, for me, is filler. If you are scraping to find one last card for your deck, you can run it, but this definitely isn't a great 4-drop that you want to have in your deck. Try to avoid it if possible. Finally, Gideon's Defeat, and this one kind of takes the brunt of it for this entire cycle. And it's just a warning, I'm not going to show all of them in every color because it would get redundant, but basically, never play the color hate cycle in your main deck. Start with them in your sideboard. If you run into a matchup in the right colors and you feel the effect is good, bring them in, but never, ever, ever play any of the color hate cycle in your main deck. So moving on to our blue cards, we start with the underrated or good blue cards, and Aerial Guide is pretty insane. Windrake is a staple limited common in blue, and this is a Windrake with an upside. Not only can it get in for 2 in the air, it's on curve, but it can also make one of your big ground creatures swing in for a ton of damage to close out the game. One of the best blue commons in the entire set. As far as Striped Riverwinder, it's kind of like the Angel we talked about. Not a great card by its mana cost. 7 mana for a 5/5 hexproof is, kind of okay. But the fact that you can cycle it away most games, and then sometimes, in the late game, play it as a big finisher, maybe enchant it up with something to make it even better, makes it a pretty reasonable inclusion for slower blue decks. And then we have Omnius Sphinx, which is an air elemental with upside. An air elemental, kind of like we were talking with Windrake, is a great blue limited card. 4/4 flyer for 5 mana is first pickable limited card on its own, very, very strong, and the upside of being able to mess with combat or prevent some damage by cycling something to make your opponent's creature smaller is very good. So I think this is one of the better blue uncommons in the entire set. This would be a card that would make me want to play blue if I open it in my sealed pool. As far as the overrated or not so great blue cards, we start with Supreme Will, which is basically a card that's better in constructed than limited. Mana Leak, kind of okay in limited. Anticipate, kind of the same way. You have 2 meh effects in limited combined together, and that doesn't make Supreme Will very good. If you're a controlling blue deck, I think you can play it, but for the most part, you don't want to just slam this in any blue deck. As far as not slamming in every blue deck, I think Unsummon is going to be one of the more overrated cards in the set. People tend to think, oh, Unsummon is good, returning a creature for 1 mana is good, and while it's good in certain decks, if you're on a tempo plan, if you have the 1/3 that can deal damage and draw a card, things like that, if you have prowess triggers, Unsummon gets much better. But if you're just playing a random blue deck or a more controlling blue deck, you really want to try to find hard removal that gets rid of a creature forever over Unsummon, because Unsummon is card disadvantage. It costs you a card, it doesn't cost your opponent card, it only costs them mana. So unless you can take advantage of that tempo swing of your opponent having to spend more mana to recast their thing, even though you're losing a card, then Unsummon actually isn't very good. Finally, we have Proven Combatant, which just isn't big enough to be relevant. You don't really want 1 mana 1/1s. It might sound good to start off your curve on the first turn when your opponent's probably not doing anything, but it just gets outclassed so quickly that I don't think that it's something you want in most of your decks. Moving on to black cards, we start with the good ones, the underrated blue cards. Lethal Sting, one of the best removal spells in the format, kills anything 3 mana, which is great even at sorcery speed. And remember, we're playing limited, and most limited decks are pretty creature heavy, so you should usually have something around to put a counter on, so the downside isn't that big of a deal. And there's even some -1/-1 counter synergies. If you get lucky, open a Hapatra or the uncommon Spider, you get some benefit from putting -1/-1 counters on your stuff. We also have Marauding Bone Slasher, and this card I think everyone realizes is probably good in a zombie deck. A 3/3 for 3 is a good rate, but what I wanted to mention is it's perfectly fine in an aggressive black deck even if you don't have many zombie synergies. The body is good enough that if you're just trying to beat down and kill your opponent, even with no synergies, a 3/3 for 3 is very good. I think if you're a controlling black deck without zombie synergies, I'd be more skeptical because you really want blockers in controlling decks. But if you're a black X aggro deck, even without many zombies, very happy to be playing Marauding Bone Slasher. Finally, we have Banewhip Punisher, which is probably the best black uncommon in the entire set. This card is so insane. When it comes into play, you can kill a little thing, or even just trim down a bigger thing with the counter. Then for just 1 more mana, you can destroy anything with a -1/-1 counter. So you can play it for 3, have a creature, kill a little thing, or play it for 4 mana and immediately kill something. Also do some tricks where you put a counter on something later and kill it later. So just a very strong card. This is a card that would make me want to play black in my sealed pool if I happen to have a copy or 2. Moving on to the overrated black cards. First off, Doomfall. So Thoughtseize isn't a great card in limited, and being able to make your opponent sacrifice something or exile something like an Edict effect isn't that great in limited. It's okay, but it's worse than targeted removal because your opponent's going to always sack their worst creature, their random 1-drop, a random token. So while Doomfall is fine, I think people will think it's better than it actually is. I'm not saying you should never have Doomfall in your deck, but I could imagine not every black deck wanting Doomfall in the main deck. Razaketh's Ritual suffers from the tutor problem, and this is more about tutors in general in Limited than Razaket's Ritual. There's actually some upside with Razaket's Ritual because you can cycle it away, which makes it better than most tutors in Limited. But the point about tutors in Limited is they're massively overrated by a lot of people. A lot of people think, oh, I can get my best card out of my deck, and how good your tutor is, though, is dependent on how good your best card is. If you have a Nicol Bolas, if you get lucky and open a Bomb Mythic, even a Great Bomb Rare, then Razaket's Ritual is fine. But on the other hand, if you're just using it to be the top end of a black-white zombie deck, and you're getting a random 3-drop, 4-drop, something like that, it's not worth the mana cost of actually having it in your deck. Finally, we have Carrion Screecher, and Carrion Screecher is about the format. So one of the things we know about this Limited format is lots of -1/-1 counters. So many things that put -1/-1 counters on things, and that kind of makes me skeptical of creatures with 1 toughness, but especially things like Carrion Screecher that are 4 mana. A 3/1 flyer would be great in some formats, but in this format, it's a little risky because it's going to die to a random Festering Mummy or any of the million effects that put -1/-1 counters on things. So Carrion Screecher is much, much worse in Hour of Devastation pre-release in Limited than it would be in some other formats. Moving on to the red cards, we start with Magmaroth, and Magmaroth is just massive. It is so big. If you think about what this card actually does, it comes down as a 5/5 for 4, which is great. The next turn, it's a 4/4 for 4, which is still above the curve. The next turn, it's a 3/3 for 4, which is a Hill Giant, which isn't an embarrassing card. So even with the counters going on it, it's still just such a powerful creature. And by the time you're 2 or 3 turns down the road, you're likely going to be able to remove some of those counters by casting your removal spell, a card draw spell. So I think this is a very solid uncommon in the red colors. Stand Strangler is probably the best red uncommon in the entire set. This is not only a card that would make me want to play red, but it would make me want to find ways to have deserts in my deck. Its power is dependent on deserts, so you gotta hope you have at least a couple deserts to take advantage of it. While it's not horrible as a 4-mana 3/3, when you can play this, kill one of your opponent's creatures, and have a 3/3 body left behind, it's basically a Flame Tongue Kavu, which is one of the all-time best Limited cards in the history of Magic. So rate this highly, find ways to get deserts into your deck and play it because the payoff is definitely worth having some deserts. Finally, we have Inferno Jet, which is a card that would normally be bad. Lava Axes, definitely overrated by a lot of people. Dealing damage just to your opponent usually isn't good, but Inferno Jet is another one of those cards that, because of cycling, is actually pretty good. Maybe you cycle it away 7 or 8 out of every 10 games, but those 2 or 3 of every 10 games, it's just going to kill your opponent by 6ing them after you get an early damage. So I think because of the cycling cost, Inferno Jet is actually pretty good when similar cards without cycling are close to unplayable in most Limited decks. As far as overrated red cards, let's start with Abrade. And Abrade isn't bad. 3 damage to a creature for 2 mana is fine, but it's not as good in Limited as Constructed because there's not many powerful artifacts running around in Amonkhet block, so it's pretty much just creature damage, and that's still a perfectly fine card. I'm not saying you shouldn't play Abrade, you should play Abrade in your decks, but just be warned, you're only going to be taking advantage of the 1 mode. Thankfully, that 1 mode is still very good. We also have Firebrand Archer, which is a card that really suffers from the -1/-1 counter problem we were talking about before. So if you have a choice in this format between playing a slightly better ability on a 2-mana 2/1 or a slightly worse ability on a 2-mana 2/2, I'm going to pick the 2-mana 2/2 because I don't want my 2-drops to be dying to -1/-1 counters. Of course, if you just need a filler 2-drop, it's fine, but really be wary of 1 toughness in this format because those -1/-1 counters will really punish you. We also have Manticore Eternal, which looks like a reasonable card. 5/4 for 5 is reasonable. A flick gets in some damage if it's blocked. The downside is attacking each turn of Able is a big drawback. If you can build a tempo style deck we were talking about Unsummon, Manticore Eternal blue-red could be a great place for Unsummon, where you can force through that damage and kill your opponent quickly. But a lot of times, if you don't really build around getting through your Manticore Eternal, it's just going to die on the first attack to not very profitable blocks. So keep that in mind. The drawback is real, even though the body is good. As far as the green cards, Overcome is one of the best Limited cards in any color in this set. It's not quite an overrun, but it's still super super good. All you gotta do is flood the board with creatures, cast this, and win the game. If I open an Overcome in my pool, it's almost certainly gonna force me to play green if there's any way I can make it work, because these type of effects are just amazingly strong and limited and win games that you would otherwise lose, steal games that you shouldn't be winning. Super, super, super good. As far as the rest of the good green cards, we have Ambuscade, which is a pretty solid green removal spell. It's instant speed, and importantly, it's not fighting. It just deals damage to your opponent's creature. So usually green has these fight mechanics, which is a little risky. You need big creatures to be able to kill your opponent's stuff, or else you're just trading creatures. But Ambuscade is nice because you just kill your opponent's thing. There's still risk if they kill your creature in response, then you kind of get 2 for 1. But it's a fairly solid green removal spell because we often see fighting price like this, and this is better than fighting because you're not taking damage on your creature. Finally, we have Aronis' Stalwart, which reminds me of Gustwalker. This is kind of the green Gustwalker, and Gustwalker is a great card in Amonkhet Limited. It's not quite as good because it doesn't gain flying, although it does have a pseudo evasion where it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so little creatures. But basically, a 2/2 for 2 is already a staple of Limited. Grizzly Bears are just great curve fillers in Limited, and this is a Grizzly Bear with upside, so while I don't think it's quite as great as Gustwalker, it's still a super solid 2-drop, and you're going to want these in your deck if you open them. As far as the overrated green cards, we start off with Hope Tender. And this one, the problem is, it's not good ramp. You gotta remember that the first ability doesn't actually generate mana. All it does is fix your mana, since you are just untapping a land, so you can kind of turn one color of mana into another. If you want to ramp, you can ramp by 1 mana, and you have to exert to do it, so you're ramping by 1 mana every other turn. That's like half a mana a turn. That's not a good ramp card. However, it's still a 2/2 for 2, so it's fine as curve filler, but don't think of this as a Sylvan Caryatid or as a true ramp card, because when it comes to ramping, it's not that great. Next, we have Dune Diviner, which isn't a bad card, but its body is not quite what you want it to be for a 3-drop, and the ability is really slow. Not only does it make you play a ton of deserts, which you may or may not have, but then you have to spend a mana and tap an untapped desert, so it's 2 mana, essentially, because you're tapping the desert, to gain a single life. So it's just not as powerful as it might look. I'm not saying it's completely unplayable, but if you look at the cost of everything that's going into it, combined with a kind of so-so body, it's not a card that would push me into green by any means. Last off, we have Life Goes On, and this is just a general warning that you don't play Life Gain in your main deck. Please don't do that. I know it's easy when you first start building sealed pools to think of life gain as very strong, but even when you're gaining 8 with this, it's usually not worth a card in your deck. If you want to sideboard it in against a very aggressive burn deck or something, there might be situations where that's correct, but this is a card that you just never start with in your main deck under any circumstances. Moving on to our colorless cards, don't really have underrated and overrated because there's not many of them, but I did want to mention a couple of specific things. Crook of Condemnation starts in the sideboard. Even though there's a lot of Aftermath, there's a lot of Embalm, I don't think you want to start with Crook in your main deck. It's just too risky because it does nothing on its own. It's not a Relic of Progenitus because you can't cycle it for another card, and if your opponent's not playing a bunch of Eternalize and Aftermath cards, then you're just basically mulliganing yourself by playing Crook of Condemnation. Bring it in if you play against a deck that's heavy on those mechanics, but start with it in the sideboard. As far as Manolith and Traveler's Amulet, these are cards that are good if you're going to be 3 colors, or 4 colors, or 5 colors, but your typical 2-color deck, Traveler's Amulet, is basically worse than just playing an extra land. Manolith, not really great fixing. If you're trying to ramp into big stuff, it can be okay, but for the most part, only consider these for splashing, for playing 3 colors, but if you're a straight 2-color deck, you typically don't want to use a slot on either of these cards when you're building your sealed deck. Finally, we have some of our multicolor cards. Farm to market is great because the front half is great. The back half is whatever. It can be fine in a long game. But just destroying an attacking or blocking creature at instant speed for 3 mana makes farm good on its own. Even if you're not white-blue and you're white-black or white-green or whatever, you can still definitely play farm just because the front half is so good. And struggle is the same way. The back half is almost never going to be relevant, but the front half is very good. On turn 3, you're dealing 3 damage to a creature that's going to kill most 3-drops. On turn 8 or turn 9, you're killing basically anything in the format at instant speed, assuming you make your land drops. So this this is another card, you don't gotta be red-green, even though it's a 2-color card technically, perfectly fine to play that in your mono red deck because the removal spell aspect of it is super solid. Finally, Unraveling Mummy is awesome in Limited. Of course, it's a little restricted. You gotta have enough zombies to take advantage of it. But if you get enough zombies, this card is so strong. It makes combat so impossible. It makes it hard for your opponent to win the race because of the lifelink. So while it's a bit slow for constructed, it is a legitimate bomb, assuming you have enough zombies in Limited. So if you open 1 or 2 of these, I would be counting the number of zombies I have in my pool and trying to make it work if possible, because this card is great. As far as the overrated multicolor cards, we have Claim, which just isn't very good in Limited because creatures with converted mana cost 2 or less aren't that great in Limited. In Constructed, you're getting back Snapcaster Mages and Tarmogoyfs and Death Shadows. In Limited, you're just getting back Grizzly Bears, and getting back a Grizzly Bear isn't necessarily worth a slot in your deck, especially since it's going to be happening in the late game. So I think maybe if you're black-red, it's okay, but for the most part, I don't think you really want to be playing this in your main deck. And then Appeal isn't a bad card, but I just want to give a word of warning. It's much better if you're actually going wide with creatures, so take that into consideration when you're choosing whether or not you should put this into your deck. If you're able to kind of flood the board with tokens and do stuff like that, Appeal is very good. But if you're just kind of a normal green deck, it's only sort of so-so, and kind of easy to get blown out if your opponent can kill things in response, because it doesn't even have to necessarily kill the attacking creature. They can kill another creature, which makes Appeal give less of a power and toughness boost, which maybe lets them block profitably. So keep that in mind. If you're going wide with tokens, it's awesome. Otherwise, it's kind of okay. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our overrated and underrated Hour of Devastation cards for pre-release. So what do you think? Are you going to pre-release? What are you hoping to open? What are you most excited to play with? Are there any other underrated or overrated cards that I didn't talk about? Anyway, let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.